The cow manure hit her face with a sickening splat. The crowd gasped and laughed. Nobody defended the hunched old woman in the faded uniform. They had no idea they were humiliating a decorated military hero who once saved their entire town. Martha Reynolds moved slowly through Riverdale's Saturday Farmers Market, her weather hands gripping a simple wooden cane. At 75, her stooped posture and thinning white hair made her nearly invisible among the bustling crowd. She wore a faded navy blue button-up shirt, clean but worn at the edges, with small military pins carefully attached to the collar. Her khaki slacks hung loosely on her diminished frame. The morning sun warmed the marketplace as vendors called out to passing customers. Children darted between stalls selling fresh produce, homemade jams, and local crafts. Martha paused occasionally, carefully counting coins from her small cloth purse before making modest purchases. "Just these tomatoes today, please," she said to the vendor, her voice soft but clear. The young man barely looked at her as he took her money. Martha had lived alone since returning to Riverdale 15 years ago. Most townspeople knew her only as that old military lady who kept to herself in the small white house at the edge of town. Few bothered to learn more. Her daily walks to town were exercises in both physical determination and quiet dignity. Today, she'd pinned her old service medal to her shirt, a small personal celebration of her enlistment anniversary. 57 years since she joined the Army Intelligence Corps, back when women were barely welcome. The medal was her private reminder of a life of service few would ever know about. As Martha made her way toward the bakery stall, she didn't notice the group of young men watching her from the corner of the market. Scott Miller, the 28-year-old son of the largest farm owner in the county, nudged his friends and smirked as the old woman struggled to maneuver between crowded stalls. "Watch this," he muttered. "Old lady soldiers on patrol." Scott Miller stood over 6 feet tall with the confident posture of someone who'd never faced real consequences. His father's wealth and influence in Riverdale had ensured that. Today, he and his 3 friends had been drinking since breakfast, their laughter growing louder with each beer. "Hey there, General," Scott called out as Martha approached. "Fighting any wars today?" Martha glanced up briefly, then continued examining bread loaves at the bakery stall. She'd learned long ago that engagement often encouraged troublemakers. "I'm talking to you, soldier girl," Scott persisted, stepping closer. The baker behind the counter looked down, suddenly busy with reorganizing rolls. "Excuse me," Martha said quietly, trying to step around him. Scott moved to block her path. "What's with the medal? You get that for typing really fast." His friend snickered. "My grandpa was in Vietnam. Said women in the service just made coffee and filed papers." Martha's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained silent. Around them, market-goers glanced over then away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. "She can't hear you, Scott," one of his friends called out. "Too old." Scott reached out and flicked a medal on Martha's collar. "This real, Grandma? Or something from a costume shop?" Martha finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "Young man, please let me pass." Her calm response seemed to irritate Scott further. "Or what? You'll court-martial me?" His friends erupted in laughter. A few feet away, Diane from a florist shop watched with growing discomfort. She'd greeted Martha every market day for years, though they'd never really spoken beyond pleasantries. Now she shifted nervously, considering whether to intervene. Scott began mimicking Martha's hunched walk, exaggerating her limp to the delight of his friends. 2 teenage girls nearby giggled behind their hands. "Attention!" Scott shouted, giving an exaggerated salute. Captain Fossil reporting for duty. The marketplace had grown quieter now, conversations dying as more people turned to watch. Martha stood perfectly still, her weather hands clutching both her cane and small shopping bag, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. "Let's see your papers, soldier," Scott continued, his voice growing louder as he fed off the attention. He stepped closer, invading Martha's personal space. "What did you even do in the Army? File paperwork? Cook meals?" Martha remained silent, but her knuckles whitened around her cane. Decades of military discipline kept her expression neutral despite the public humiliation. Maybe she was a spy, One of Scott's friends jeered, making exaggerated movements like a cartoon character. Super secret grandma spy. Scott's face lit up at this new angle. Is that it? Were you a spy, Granny? Sneaking around behind enemy lines with your walker? He grabbed a loaf of bread from the bakery stall and held it up like a radio. Come in, headquarters. The enemy's planning nap time after bingo. The baker finally spoke up. Come on, Scott. That's enough. Scott spun around. What? We're just having fun with the local hero. He turned back to Martha. You're a hero, right? What's this medal for? Oldest living veteran? Martha finally spoke, her voice steady. I served my country for 26 years, young man. 26 years of what? Typing and making coffee. Scott shot back. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the onlookers. An older man shook his head disapprovingly, but said nothing. Scott reached toward the medal on Martha's collar. Let me see this amazing medal. Martha stepped back. Please don't touch me. Oh! Scott's friends chorused. Giving orders now, General? Scott's face hardened. He stepped closer again. You know what? My dad pays more in taxes than your pension's worth. You're welcome for funding your retirement. Martha finally attempted to walk away, her dignity intact, but her shoulders perhaps a bit more stooped than before. Walking away from the enemy? Scott called after her. That's not very brave, soldier. Scott wasn't finished. As Martha slowly made her way toward the market exit, he glanced at his friends with a malicious grin. Watch this, he muttered. Scott strode quickly to the nearby livestock area where his father's farm had a stall. Farm workers were cleaning out the cattle transport trailer, shoveling manure into wheelbarrows. Hey, Jim, let me borrow that, Scott said, grabbing a handful of fresh cow manure from the wheelbarrow before the worker could object. Scott's friends realized what was happening. One of them half-heartedly protested, Dude, maybe don't. But Scott was already moving, the foul-smelling mass held in his gloved hand. He approached Martha from behind as she waited for a young family to pass in front of her. Hey, General, Scott called. When Martha turned, the manure hit her directly in the face and chest, splattering across her metal and carefully maintained uniform shirt. The crowd gasped collectively. The revolting substance clung to her thin white hair and dripped down her wrinkled face. For a moment, complete silence fell over the marketplace. Then Scott's friends erupted in laughter. A few teenagers joined in nervously. Most adults looked away in embarrassment or disgust. Martha stood perfectly still, manure dripping from her chin onto her shoes. 57 years of military bearing kept her from crying out or crumpling to the ground. Instead, she slowly reached into her pocket for a handkerchief and wiped her eyes with shaking hands. Bullseye! Scott shouted, high-fiving his friends. Direct hit on the enemy. An elderly man finally stepped forward. For God's sake, son. What? It's just a joke, Scott replied, but even some of his friends were no longer laughing. Martha's eyes remained dry, but something in them had changed. Not defeat, but a stillness that came from decades of facing adversity. Without a word, she turned and continued her slow walk toward the market exit, leaving a trail of foul footprints behind her. Martha had made it halfway to the street when a voice called out behind her. Martha? Martha Reynolds. Wait! She didn't turn at first, focused only on maintaining her composure until she could reach the privacy of her home. Harold Patterson, Riverdale's 80-year-old former mayor, hurried toward her as quickly as his own cane would allow. His face was flushed with exertion and anger. Martha, please wait, he called again, catching up to her at the edge of the market. Let me help you. She finally stopped, still not turned to face him. I prefer to handle this myself, Harry. Harold lowered his voice. What that boy did, it's unforgivable. Let me drive you home. Two women from the church auxiliary approached cautiously, offering tissues and concerned glances. Mrs. Reynolds, we saw what happened. Can we help? Martha finally turned, her face still streaked with filth despite her efforts to clean it. Thank you, but I'll manage. Harold placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Martha served with distinction in military intelligence, he told the women firmly. She deserves better than this. One of the women blinked in surprise. Military intelligence? I thought she was just... Just what? Harold challenged. Just an old woman? Martha Reynolds saved lives. Important ones. People nearby had stopped to listen. A middle-aged man approached. Mayor Patterson, is everything all right? No. Frank, it's not, Harold replied loudly enough for others to hear. Do you know who this is? 30 years ago, Martha's intelligence work prevented a terrorist attack on the Miller processing plant. Half the town would have lost their jobs if not for her. Murmurs spread through the growing crowd. The Miller processing plant employed nearly a third of Riverdale's residents, including Frank himself. That true? Frank asked Martha directly. She straightened slightly, wiping another spot of filth from her medal. It was classified then. Mostly still is. She received a presidential commendation, Harold continued. One of the highest honors in intelligence service. Scott and his friends, still lingering nearby, overheard the conversation. Scott's smug expression faltered slightly. The medal, someone whispered. That's what that medal is. Martha said nothing, but her eyes met Scott's across the crowd. Not with anger, but with a steady gaze of someone who had faced far worse than him and endured. By evening, Riverdale was buzzing with the story. Harold Patterson had made certain of that. At the Riverview Diner, Frank Miller, Scott's father and owner of both Miller Farms and the processing plant, sat in stunned silence as Harold laid out the full story that had been kept quiet for 3 decades. The threat was real, Frank, Harold explained to the small gathering of town leaders who had assembled upon hearing the news. Foreign operatives had targeted our plant because of the defense contract work. Martha was stationed at Fort Meade then. She intercepted communications, decoded the threat, and personally drove through a blizzard to deliver the warning because phone lines were down. Beth Williams, the diner owner, shook her head. All these years and we never knew. She wasn't allowed to tell anyone, Harold said. That's how intelligence works. Outside the diner windows, a small crowd had formed. Word had spread quickly about the incident at the market. Smartphones had captured Scott's cruel act, and now those same devices were sharing stories about Martha's service. David Chun, owner of the hardware store and a Vietnam veteran himself, had organized a small group of local veterans to stand outside Martha's house, a spontaneous honor guard ensuring she wasn't disturbed. Inside the diner, Frank Miller's face had grown increasingly pale. And my son, he started, unable to finish. Your son humiliated her publicly, Harold completed firmly. Threw Manure at a 75-year-old decorated veteran who once saved his inheritance. The local newspaper editor, who had been taking notes, looked up. The Pentagon just confirmed her service. I contacted them an hour ago. They won't give details, but they issued a statement praising intelligence specialist Reynolds' distinguished career and significant contributions to national security. Frank stood abruptly. I need to find Scott. But Scott was already learning the truth from every direction. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from friends and neighbors. The video of his prank had spread throughout the community, accompanied now by rumors and partial truths about Martha's service. By nightfall, a different crowd had gathered at the town square, veterans from Riverdale and neighboring communities, some in uniform, others wearing caps and insignia from their service days. They stood silently, holding impromptu candles and flashlights. And in her small white house, Martha Reynolds sat in her rocking chair, cleaned up now but still feeling the weight of public humiliation and unexpected exposure. Her phone rang again, another call from a military buddy who'd somehow heard the news. After decades of anonymity, her story was no longer her own. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Martha emerged from her house to find a clean, pressed uniform hanging on her porch railing. A gift from fellow veterans. Beside it was a small note, with respect from those who understand service. She touched it gently, then noticed David Chin standing respectfully at the edge of her yard. The community would like to apologize, he said simply. At the town square, if you're willing. Martha considered this for a long moment before nodding once. By 10 o'clock, it seemed the entire town had gathered in the square. Scott Miller stood uncomfortably beside his father at the edge of the small platform that had been erected. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by the sullen look of someone forced into apology. When Martha appeared, wearing the gifted uniform that hung loosely on her thin frame, but bore her original medals and insignia, a hush fell over the crowd. She walked slowly but with perfect military posture, her spine straight despite her years. Frank Miller stepped forward, attempting to take control of the situation as he always had. "Mrs. Reynolds, on behalf of my family, and particularly my son, I want to extend our deepest—" Martha raised her hand slightly, and to everyone's surprise, Frank fell silent. She didn't raise her voice, but decades of command presence made her words carry across the square. "I didn't serve for recognition or gratitude," she began. "I serve because there are things we're protecting. Dignity, respect, community." Her eyes scanned the crowd. The same things that were missing yesterday. She turned slightly toward Scott, who couldn't meet her gaze. "Young man, I don't want your apology," she said clearly. "I want your understanding, not just of what I did, but of what service means." Her words hung in the air, weightier than any shouted condemnation could have been. "When you threw Manure at me, you weren't just disrespecting one old woman. You were dismissing every sacrifice made by every person who ever put on a uniform." 6 months later, Martha sat on a bench in the newly dedicated Veterans Memorial Park, watching Scott Miller guide a group of elementary school children through the modest museum display. His community service sentence had evolved into something more meaningful than anyone expected. "And this section honors our hometown heroes," Scott explained, stopping at a display featuring Martha's photograph and service commendation, including intelligence specialist Reynolds, whose actions saved countless lives. The children listened attentively, a stark contrast to the disrespect of that market day half a year earlier. Martha smiled slightly as Scott caught her eye and nodded respectfully before continuing the tour. Harold settled onto the bench beside her. "You transformed that boy," he said quietly. Martha shook her head. "He transformed himself when given a chance." Sometimes dignity speaks louder than humiliation. Sometimes respect grows in the most unlikely soil. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. How can we better honor those who serve silently among us? Your respect in the comments means everything to veterans like Martha.